Thank you very much, Ed, and also Susan, for having me for this keynote. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here with you in Rome and to talk about this important topic of digital arts and humanities with and for society, building infrastructures of engagement. And I hope that my talk will address some of the topics, the challenges and opportunities that you have been discussing already during yesterday and this morning's meetings. And I hope that my lecture will speak to those topics as well. Since half a year or so, I need glasses for reading my text, so bear with me if I need to sometimes go down to my manuscript. And I'm not used, actually, to give lectures in being seated, but to stand up, but I will do my best to be as present bodily as well. My speaker position, and Ed already mentioned it, will be that of a digital historian who has been thinking about the interferences of the digital in thinking, doing, and narrating history. But my reflections today aim to touch upon epistemological, ethical, and methodological questions that go beyond the discipline of history and will be hopefully relevant for the larger DARIAH community. At C2DH, though, in Luxembourg, we have put a lot of emphasis on building open science infrastructures of engagement, be it through the development of educational platforms such as Ranke 2, an online tutorial for digital source criticism, the launching of a new publication platform for digital history, the Journal of Digital History, or the development of search interfaces for large databases of retro-digitized source collections such as impresso, by paying special attention to the design of interfaces as key mediators of human-machine interaction. So the governing question I would like to discuss with you today is, what would a digital archive interface look like if it were designed to honor the full complexity of historical evidence, meaning its plurality, its silences, its power relations, its reducible multivocality, while simultaneously inviting researchers and subjects to produce transmedia narratives that are both creative and academically rigorous. The dominant metaphor governing access to digital heritage collections is the search box. You type a keyword, you receive a ranked list of results. This interface is so deeply familiar that it has become to feel natural, as though it were the only possible relationship between a researcher or user and an archive. But as we know, the search box is not neutral. It encodes a specific theory of knowledge, that the archive contains information, that information can be retrieved, specifying it in advance, that results can be ranked by relevance, and that the most relevant result is the most valuable. Every one of these assumptions is contestable, and several of them are, in the specific context of cultural heritage research, can even be harmful. Cultural heritage archives, as we all know, are not databases of facts. They are material traces of past human activity, assembled under specific conditions of power, preserved through specific institutional decisions, described using specific conceptual frameworks and language, and made accessible through specific technological choices. The documents, photographs, sound recordings, maps, and objects they contain are not simply information to be retrieved. They are witnesses in the legal and etymological sense. They attest to something from somewhere on behalf of someone. And like all witnesses, they are partial, positioned, and shaped by what they cannot say as much as by what they can. The emergence of digital heritage collections over the past 3 decades has dramatically expanded access to these traces. Digitization projects at national archives, regional libraries, specialist institutions, and community organizations have made millions of items available online that were previously accessible only to those with the time, resources, and institutional connections to visit in person. This is a genuine democratization of access, and it would be wrong to minimize its importance. But digitization has also introduced new distortions and new risks, many of them invisible precisely because they are built into the technical infrastructure. The search box is possibly the most visible symptom of these risks. But behind it lies a deeper problem: the assumption that a digital archive can be treated as a single, unified, internally consistent corpus from which relevant items can be extracted and presented to the user in a form that transparently represents their content. This assumption underlies not only that the search box, but most of the computational text mining, network analysis, and data visualization that has been applied to digital heritage collections in the digital humanities over the past 2 decades. It is an assumption that the most sophisticated theoretical work in archival studies, interface criticism, and visual epistemology has been systematically challenging. And it is the assumption that this lecture proposes we abandon. A first step in this direction is to think more carefully about the concept of transmedia and how it challenges our often text-biased approach in diving into archival collections. The concept of transmedia storytelling, developed by Henry Jenkins in the context of commercial entertainment, where it describes the systematic dispersal of narrative elements across multiple platforms and media, turns out to be surprisingly productive when transported into the context of digital heritage research. Not because heritage research is like entertainment, but because the transmedia concept captures something that conventional scholarly communication cannot. The idea that a single story, argument, or historical account can be constitutively distributed across different media, with each medium contributing something that the others cannot, and that the whole being more than the sum of its parts. As we know, a historical event, again, I'm speaking as an historian, is never exhausted by any single medium or mode of representation. Let's take a random historical event from my home country, Belgium, social history example, the Ghent textile worker strike of 1886. It was part of the Great Belgian Strike, a massive outbreak of social unrest against devastating economic conditions, starvation wages, and hazardous factory conditions. Unlike the violent uprisings in Wallonia, the Ghent protests spurred a major shift in organizing, leading to the creation of both socialist and Christian trade unions. So when searching for historical records of this event in various online repositories, one will encounter a multitude of different sources or data, all reflecting different stories or voices of the past. None of these voices or stories is primary. None of them is the real account of the strike, for which the others are derived or against which they should be measured. They are simultaneous, incommensurable, and equally necessary. A transmedia approach to archival research takes this seriously. It produces narratives that hold these multiple planes in productive tension, using each medium's specific affordances to do the work that only that medium can do, and using the gaps and contradictions between them as interpretative resources rather than problems to be solved. Yet, retrieving such different perspectives or voices from one single repository or archival collection is rare, and was technically extremely challenging, if not impossible, in the past. With the rapid development of multimodal AI technologies, especially in the domain of retrieval-augmented generation, new and interesting perspectives seem to emerge. Retrieval-augmented generation is a computational architecture that combines, as most of you might know, two components: a retrieval system, which searches a corpus for items relevant to a given query, and a generative model, which uses the retrieved items to produce a response. The key innovation over earlier approaches to information retrieval is that the retrieval is semantic rather than lexical. Instead of matching keywords, it matches meanings, using vector embeddings that place documents, images, sounds, and other data in a shared high-dimensional space where proximity indicates conceptual relatedness. In a multimodal RAG system, this semantic retrieval operates across different types of data simultaneously. A photograph and a letter describing the same scene can be placed near each other in the embedding space, even if they share no words or were created by different people at different times. A sound recording and a newspaper article about the same event can be retrieved together in response to a query that mentions neither of them explicitly. This cross-medial retrieval is what makes multimodal RAG qualitatively different from conventional search. It allows the system to surface connections between items that no human cataloger has established, and to respond to queries that are themselves expressed in one medium which results drawn from multiple others. The implications for digital heritage research are, I think, substantial. An archive that has been indexed with a multimodal RAG system can be queried not just with keywords, but with images, with sound files, spatial coordinates, or free-form descriptions. So researchers can describe what they are looking for in whatever terms seems natural to them, and the system, ideally, will retrieve items across the full multimodal corpus of the archival multiverse. The concept of the archival multiverse, introduced by the Australian archival theorists Anne Gilliland, Sue McKemmish, and Andrew Lau in 2016, provides, I think, an interesting theoretical framework within which the possibilities and limits of multimodal RAG systems for heritage research can be most productively understood. The authors coined the term to challenge what they describe as the binary oppositions that have structured modern archival theory and practice in at least the English-speaking world. Personal archives versus corporate archives, custodial versus post-custodial management, official versus community records. These binaries, they argue, reflect a particular institutional history, the dominance of national archives focused on government records on the one side and the manuscripts tradition of libraries on the other, that has systematically excluded other ways of understanding and practicing record keeping. The archival multiverse is the conceptual space in which these exclusions become visible, and in which alternative epistemologies, for example, indigenous ways of knowing, community-based record keeping, post-custodial and post-custodian models can be articulated. The term draws deliberately on the cosmological concept of the multiverse. Just as the physical multiverse posits an ensemble of innumerable regions of space-time that are fundamentally disconnected from each other, the archival multiverse posits a plurality of evidentiary worlds that are incommensurable with each other and that cannot be unified into a single coherent account. What counts as a record, who has the authority to create and preserve it, what purpose it serves, and who has the right to access it, these questions receive different answers in different archival worlds, and no single answer can claim universal validity. This theoretical framework has direct implications for the design of digital heritage interfaces. If the archive is genuinely multiversal, if it is constituted by plural, incommensurable, simultaneously valid ways of knowing and remembering, then an interface that presents it as a unified corpus from which relevant items can be retrieved in response to a unified query is systematically distorting what it mediates. The interface needs to make the multiverse visible, to show which worlds are present in the corpus, which are absent, how they relate to each other, where they conflict, and what conflicts mean. Multimodal rack systems are technically capable of querying across boundaries that have traditionally separated archival collections. But on the other side, rack systems also inherit the biases, gaps, and distortions of the archives they index. If the National Archives holdings on the 1886 strike are dominated by factory inspection reports and police records, the rack system will return results dominated by factory inspection reports and police records. Not because it has made an editorial decision to privilege official sources, but because they are what is there. The worker-authored records that do not exist cannot be retrieved. The oral histories that were never recorded cannot be surfaced. And the photographs that were not taken or not preserved cannot be indexed. But the crucial point for me is that these absences are not random or accidental. They are produced by specific historical processes of inclusion and exclusion, preservation and destruction, description and silence. The factory owner's correspondence survives because it was kept by an institution with the resources and motivation to preserve it. The striker's diary does not survive. Or if it does, it is rather in a community archive or a private family collection that has not been digitized, described, or connected to the systems that the rack is querying. So the asymmetry is structural, not technical. A rack system that is not designed to make this asymmetry visible will reproduce invisibly. It will return results that look comprehensive, that seem to cover the available evidence, while systematically suppressing the fact that what is available is itself the product of historical power relations. I will not go into the whole theoretical discourse on archive and power that, for example, Derrida has done. So, but how to deal with inherent power asymmetries when working with digital archive collections? Is there a way to visualize or making them explicit when developing new rack-based search interfaces? When thinking about that question, I went back to a work of a comics scholar, Nick Sousanis, who published in 2015 his PhD dissertation as a graphic novel with Stanford University Press. I think it was Stanford or Harvard, sorry. The title was Unflattening, and its argument, made simultaneously in words and images using the specific formal capacities of the comics medium, was that Western scholarly culture has systematically privileged a single mode of knowing, linear, verbal, sequential, and hierarchically organized. This mode of knowing Sousanis calls flatness. It is not wrong, exactly, but it is radically incomplete. It can only ever capture one dimension of a reality that is irreducibly multidimensional. So the comic form that Sousanis chose for his dissertation is not merely the vehicle for his argument, it is also its demonstration. A comics page holds multiple images in spatial relation simultaneously, refuses very often the linear sequence of text, puts words and image in a relationship of productive tension rather than illustration, and makes the gap between the panels, what comic scholars call the gutter, a space of active interpretative work for the reader. The reader of a comic or graphic novel is not a passive recipient of information. She is a co-producer of meaning, actively constructing what happens in the spaces the images and text do not show. Sousanis' argument is explicitly epistemological. The target is not visualization per se, but the subordination of all forms of knowing to the verbal linear mode that dominates academic discourse. The proposal is not to replace that mode, but to hold multiple modes simultaneously, to design systems that can carry the irreducible multidimensionality of experience without collapsing it into a single plane. To put it short, it is a strong and, in my view, very persuasive plea for multimodality. The resonance between Sousanis' unflattening concept and the archival multiverse is not merely metaphorical. Both concepts are responses to the same underlying problem: the violence of reduction to a single dimension. For Sousanis, flatness is the condition of being locked into one mode of knowing, typically logocentric and linear. The comic form resists this by making multiple modes of knowing simultaneously present and mutually constitutive. For Gilliland, McKemmish and Lau, the archival equivalent of flatness is the orthodoxy of modern archival theory, the assumption that there is one legitimate provenance, one custodial chain, one institutional authority that determines what counts as a record. So a digital archive interface that is designed on unflattening principles would be one that refuses to flatten the multiversal plurality of the archive into a single ranked list of results. It would hold these multiple modalities, text, image, sound, spatial data, and so on, as co-equal planes, and none of it can claim priority. It would make the gaps between modalities as meaningful as the content within them. And it would require the researcher to move between sometimes incompatible positions and perspectives rather than providing a unified view from nowhere. That is why a truly multimodal interface would be not a search system that can retrieve multiple types of file, but a cognitive environment that makes the multidimensionality of the historical record available for navigation, interpretation, and narration. The technical possibility of cross-modal retrieval is not sufficient. The interface must be designed to make that plurality visible, navigable, and productive. Such an interface would pay tribute to what Johanna Drucker has framed as humanistic approach to data visualization and interpretation. Humanistic inquiry acknowledges the situated, partial, and constitutive character of knowledge production, the recognition that knowledge is constructed, taken, and not simply given as a natural representation of pre-existing fact. The implications for visualizations are radical. When humanists have adopted computational tools, charts, graphs, maps, timelines, they have borrowed conventions developed for the graphic display of information, very often in the natural and social sciences. These conventions carry with them assumptions of knowledge as observer-independent and certain. A bar chart, a timeline, a network graph, each of these performs certainty, stability, and objectivity. The rendering of information into these forms gives it a simplicity and legibility that hides every aspect of the original interpretive framework on which the data were constructed. Very often those visualizations look like, a window onto reality, but it's actually an argument made in a visual register that conceals its argumentative nature. Drucker's concept of interface criticism extends this argument to the design of the systems through which researchers access and interact with digital collections. An interface is not, as we know, a neutral conduit. It is a designed object that encodes specific assumptions about what the archive contains, how it can be queried, and what counts as relevant. The interface makes certain practices possible and others impossible, certain questions askable, others unformable. It is, to use the terminology of Bruno Latour, inscribed, a technology that inscribed politics into its design. The most fundamental interface criticism Drucker makes is the search box itself. The search box assumes a researcher who knows what they are looking for before they begin looking, who can specify their query in advance in the system's terms. It assumes a corpus that can be queried and that is coherent enough and consistently described enough to respond to a query with relevant results. And it assumes a result space that can be ranked, that has a metric of relevance against which items can be compared. Each of these assumptions fail systematically for most of the serious humanistic research that most of us, I think, are doing. Drucker's alternative proposal is for what she calls probabilistic critical hermeneutics, an approach to interface design that makes the interpretative, partial, and constructed character of capta visible in the interface itself. Rather than presenting results as if they were objective, the interface would show how they were found, what assumptions drove the retrieval, how confident the system is in the match, what alternatives may be considered and excluded, and what the limits of the corpus are. There is a second dimension to Drucker's interface criticism that is less often discussed, but equally important, I think. That is that she insists that interfaces should be designed for subjects rather than users. This distinction matters. A user is a goal-directed agent who wants to accomplish a specific task efficiently, to find a particular document, to answer a particular question, to complete a particular research step. The design logic of most interfaces is optimized for users in this sense. It aims to get them what they want as quickly and frictionlessly as possible. A subject, in the humanistic sense, is something way more complex and less predictable. Subjects bring their own interpretive positions their own histories, their own affective investments to the archive encounter. Their relationship with the archive is not instrumental, but hermeneutic. They are not extracting information from a database, but entering into a conversation with evidence that speaks to them differently depending on who they are and what they bring to the encounter. The best archive interfaces are not the ones that get researchers what they want most quickly. They are the ones that make possibly the unexpected discovery, the productive confusion, the encounter with evidence that challenges what the researcher thought they knew. This distinction between user and subject connects directly to the polyvocality argument that I want to develop in the second part of my talk. An interface designed for users assumes a unified and goal-directed agent, but I'm way more interested as an historian in thinking about an interface that challenges me as a subject, as a critical thinker, rather than a user. So far, I've mainly focused on epistemological questions. How do we know what the archive contains? How should an interface represent that knowledge honestly? But the archive raises ethical questions that are distinct from and not reducible to epistemological ones. The epistemological question is, how do we know what the archive contains? And the ethical question is, who was possibly harmed by what the archive omits, distorts, or speaks for, and what do we owe them? The distinction is important because it changes the nature of the remedial action required. Epistemic transparency, so showing confidence scores, flagging OCR quality, surfacing provenance chains, naming archival silences, and so on, is a design problem. It can, at least in principle, be solved by sufficiently sophisticated interface design. Ethical accountability to the communities whose records were never kept, whose testimonies were destroyed, whose voices were actively suppressed, and whose descendants live with the consequences of that suppression, is a political commitment that no interface can substitute for, though an interface can either honor or betray it. The South African archivist Verne Harris has articulated this distinction most forcefully. Drawing on Derrida's concept of the archive fever, Harris argues that the archive is not merely a site of knowledge production, but a site of juridical power. The archontic power Derrida identifies, so the power to gather, classify, shelter, and consign, is not an abstract or metaphorical power. It is the power that determined whose records the apartheid state preserved and whose it destroyed, whose experience were deemed worthy of documentation and whose were consigned to silence. So Harris' concept of archives for justice extends this beyond the South African context to a general principle. Archival work is a form of political practice, and the design of systems for accessing and navigating archives is a form of political action. An interface that presents the archive as a unified corpus from which relevant information can be retrieved is never politically neutral. It reproduces power relations that produced the corpus in the first place. So the most important ethical implication of this framework for interface design is the treatment of archival silences. In conventional digital heritage interfaces, a silence is simply the absence of a result. The system has nothing to say about why there are no records of the voices, experiences, or perspectives that the researcher is looking for. The silence is invisible. It presents itself as a null result rather than as a structurally produced gap in the evidentiary record. Recent theoretical work on archival silences has argued for a more active approach. A silence in the archive is not the same as a silence in history. It is a silence produced by specific decisions. The distinction is crucial. The absence of worker-authored records in the archives of the 1886 Ghent strike is not evidence that no workers wrote anything or that their experience left no traces. It is evidence that those traces were not preserved. Technically, this means that a well-designed interface should distinguish between different kinds of abscesses. Some abscesses are gaps in digitization. The physical records exist but have not been digitized or described, and this is the case for, I think, 95% of the preserved heritage, analog heritage we have. Some absences are gaps in preservation. The records may have existed but were destroyed, lost, or never systematically collected. Other absences are structural. The communities whose experience the records would document were never served by the institutions that preserved things. And some absences are actively produced. Records have been destroyed because someone in power decided they should not exist anymore. The ethical stakes are highest, I think, actually in the context of colonial archives, collections assembled during periods of colonial rule that contain records produced by, about, and often against colonized peoples who had no say in their creation, preservation, or subsequent use. Post-colonial scholarship has developed an extensive critique of the colonial archive, arguing that it is not merely incomplete, but actively harmful. It encodes the epistemologies and power relations of colonial rule in its very organization, description, and access structures. This critique has direct implications for the design of digital heritage interfaces that include colonial materials. Recent work on polyvocal provenance reporting, for example, by scholars such as Victor de Boer at the Cultural AI Lab in the Netherlands, or Alan Charlesworth and others at the Turing Institute, have demonstrated that even with the best intentions, the data model underlying an interface tends to resolve competing claims about the origin, meaning, and ownership of objects into a single structured record. The ethical demand is not merely to represent multiple perspectives alongside the official account, but to let generally competing claims remain unresolved, to refuse the institutional pressure towards a single authoritative account. This is an extremely difficult design problem. It requires an interface that can hold genuine contradiction, that can present two accounts of an object's origin, or two interpretations of a document's meaning, or two evaluations of whether a collection should be accessible at all, without educating them or presenting one as the default. Most interfaces are not designed to do this. Their data models assume that for each object there is a single correct set of metadata which the interface exists to display. The concept of inscription, developed by Bruno Latour and his colleagues in science and technology studies, I think provides a useful vocabulary for analyzing how such values, assumptions, and power relations are built into the technical artifact or infrastructure. When a technology is designed, specific theories of the world, assumptions about users and their needs, specific visions of what the technology should enable and what it should present are inscribed in material form. As we have seen, the search box inscribes the theory of knowledge retrieval based on keyword matching and relevance ranking, and a model of the researcher as goal-directed and result evaluating. Once inscribed, these values and assumptions are not easily challenged or overridden. The technology scripts the user. It defines a program of action that the user is expected to follow, and it makes deviations from that program difficult or invisible. The implication for digital heritage interface design is clear. If we want interfaces that make epistemological transparency visible, that surface archival silences, that resist the pull towards meta-narrative synthesis, that honor the plurality of the archival multiverse, then these commitments must be inscribed in the interface design itself. They cannot be supplied by the user who is sufficiently sophisticated to think about them. They must be built into the visual grammar, the interaction logic, and the information architecture of the system in such a way that they are encountered by every user, better subject, regardless of their prior knowledge or critical orientation. The Impresso project, which some of you might know, a collaborative digital humanities project of the EPFL, University of Zurich, and the C2DH, provides, I think, one of the most sophisticated examples of a heritage interface that takes Inscription seriously. Impresso is a platform for the exploration of multilingual historical newspaper and radio archives, and its interface is explicitly designed to make the constructed, partial, and uncertain nature of its data visible to researchers. The Impresso interface integrates several layers of semantic enrichment, topic modeling, named entity recognition, text reuse detection, and so on. But crucially, it does not hide this enrichment behind a clean result surface. The quality of OCR transcription is displayed directly on the document fragments, so that researchers encounter the uncertainty of the underlying data as they use them. The provenance of each enrichment, whether it was generated automatically or verified by a human, is indicated. The coverage of the corpus is shown in aggregate so that researchers can see where the archive is dense and where it is thin before they begin querying. The Impresso team describes their design philosophy as, I quote, transparent generosity, an interface that gives researchers rich access to the corpus while being honest about the limitations of that access. This is precisely the Latourian inscription logic applied to epistemological humility. The interface design scripts the researcher to take uncertainty seriously, not because they are required to read a long methodological disclaimer, but because uncertainty is part of the visual grammar of each and every result they encounter. The challenge which the designer of any richer, more multimodal system will face is how to extend this transparency across all the dimensions we have discussed. Not only OCR quality, but modal confidence. Not only corpus coverage, but structural silences. Not only provenance chains, but the ethical status of records in those claims. The call for multivocality in digital heritage has, of course, become something close to a consensus in the field. But consensus can obscure important distinctions. And the distinction between different registers of multivocality, I think, is crucial. Drawing on musical vocabulary, I think one could possibly distinguish 4 registers. Monophony as the single authoritative voice, the institutional account, the official narrative, the expert interpretation, presented as the only legitimate perspective. Homophony is the appearance of multivocality that is actually a form of subordination. Multiple voices are present, but they are harmonized towards a single message. The community perspectives added as supplementary panels around the central official account. Polyphony is a genuine form of multivocality. Multiple voices present simultaneously, but non-architecturally dominant, each contributing to something the others cannot. And finally, cacophony. That is a kind of most radical form, unresolved, dissonant plurality in which the voices generally contradict each other and the interface refuses to adjudicate. Most heritage interfaces that I've been studying claim actually multivocality, but what they produce is homophony. The community perspective is added, but the interface's visual grammar still places the official account at the center, and the community voice may be at the margin. Multiple representations are present, but the interface information architecture ensures that one of them is encountered first, framed most prominently, and returned by default. This is not multivocality, it is the performance of multivocality in the service of a single dominant voice. The meta-narrative risk is even subtler than the monophony risk, and in some ways more dangerous. A meta-narrative can emerge even from a system that retrieves multiple sources and presents multiple perspectives if the interface architecture organizes them into a coherent explanatory structure. The tendency of generative AI systems to produce fluent, synthesizing responses is precisely that risk. A well-written summary of the 1886 Ghent strike that draws on factory records, newspaper reports, labor archives simultaneously, even if it names its sources, has already made editorial decisions about which fragments to foreground, which tensions to smooth, and whose framing to adopt for the organizing narrative. In other words, fluency performs authority. A text that is well-written, internally coherent, and apparently comprehensive will be received as authoritative regardless the caveats and hedges that a careful author has inserted. The reader's encounter with the synthesizing narrative is an encounter with a shaped author account, not an encounter with the archival evidence itself. This is, of course, true for all scholarly writing. But the issue is particularly acute in systems where the synthesis is generated automatically rather than authored deliberately, because the automation conceals the authorial choices that shaped the synthesis. Again, the implication for interface design is not that synthesis should be banned, but that it should be made visible as a synthesis, and that researchers should be invited and required to encounter the underlying evidence before or alongside the synthesized account. An interface that defaults to a synthesis summary, even a careful hedged, source-attributed, uncertainty-flagged summary, is already tilting towards the meta-narrative. But how to avoid such an authoritative approach, a meta-narrative approach? One possible strategy could be gamification. Designing a polyphonic interface that would invite subjects to explore the archival multiverse in both a multimodal and curiosity-driven way. Deep game design, what Ian Bogost calls procedural rhetoric, could be generally productive for thinking about archive interfaces and transmedia heritage narratives. Bogost's central argument is that games constitute a distinct form of rhetoric. They make arguments not through words or images alone, but through the logic of the rule system they instantiate. The rules of a game are a theory of the world. Playing the game is a way of experiencing and evaluating that theory. I'm looking at time, maybe. It's 12. Yeah, I'm going a bit fast. Not diving more into the gamification, but coming to more or less the concluding remarks. So drawing together the theoretical frameworks developed so far, I would like to finish my reflections by proposing a set of design principles for what I would tentatively call the archival multiverse narrative studio. An interface that combines the epistemological transparency of a system like Impresso with the multivocality commitment of polyvocal heritage design, the unflattening logic of Sousanis, the capta epistemology of Drucker, and the ethical accountability of Harris, while also providing researchers with the tool to produce transmedia narratives grounded in that archival evidence. So what I want to propose is not less than the kind of egg-laying wool mix-sew of cultural heritage interface design. And yeah, you see here some experiments I did in playing around with Claude to see how such an interface could look like. The fundamental design principle of this miraculous interface is that exploration and narration should be the same act. The researcher or the subject does not first explore the archive and then produce a narrative about it. Instead, the act of navigation is already an act of narration. And every navigational choice is a narrative choice that the interface makes visible and consequential. 7 specific design principles follow from the theoretical discussions. The first principle is that of modal co-equality. So text, image, sound, and spatial data must be presented as co-equal planes of evidence, none architecturally prior to the other. Second principle is capta marked uncertainty. Every item in the interface must carry visible markers of its epistemic status, the confidence level of its retrieval, the quality of its underlying data, and the assumptions of the model that ranked it. The third principle is provenance transparency. So the full custody chain of every item, who created it, under what conditions, and so on, must be a first-class element on the interface, not a supplementary metadata panel. The fourth principle is silence as presence. Absences in the archive must be surfaced as objects of investigation, not as a null result. The fifth principle is perspective plurality. The interface must provide multiple entry points into the archive, structured around the positions of different historical actors, and must take the researchers aware of which positions they are inhabiting and of which they are not. The sixth principle is tension preservation. Where sources conflict, where text and image tell different stories, where official and unofficial accounts are irreconcilable, where the same object carries competing provenance claims, the interface must surface the tension rather than resolving it. And the last principle is narrative accountability. When the researcher produces a narrative from archival evidence, the interface must link every claim to its sources, flag every synthesis that crosses conflicting evidence, and mark every speculative inference as such, and name every silence that the narrative traverses without being able to fill. The narrative studio then, ideally again, proposes 5 specific narrative experiments, form of archival storytelling that are simultaneously playful and academically rigorous, that exploit the specific affordances of the transmedia context, and that resist the meta-narrative pull by making the conditions of evidence production part of the story. The counterfactual fork asks, given this evidence, what would the record look like if a specific condition had been different? Used with discipline, this is a tool for making archival silence visible. A counterfactual narrative, although many historians are quite allergic to this, is a tool for making these silences, I think, productive. The perspective rotation requires that researcher and the reader inhabits multiple structural positions sequentially, and then confronts them with the moment where those positions are irreconcilable. So this is the Bogost model of procedural rhetoric in a narrative form. Gap archaeology builds a narrative specifically from the absences. Not a narrative that acknowledges gaps, but a narrative that dwells in the silence, asking what its production required, what interest is served, and what historical experience it forecloses. This is more close to what Harris demands in terms of the juridical perspective. The polyphonic montage holds multiple incompatible voices simultaneously in generally separate registers without any editorial frame that synthesizes them. The slow archive deliberately slows the encounter with primary sources, refusing the accelerating logic of efficient retrieval. An experiment I'm currently doing myself in this line is producing a documentary comic that really tries to translate several of those principles into an online narrative, which plays with the different levels of epistemological transparency, but also reflecting the ethical dimensions. And this is really a work in progress, and I can only show a few first sketches of that work. It's based on a 6-volume book series we wrote as a team of historians of technology called Making Europe, on the history of technology of Europe, where we now systematically expand these scholarly books into other forms of storytelling, podcasts, and video essays, and now interactive comics. I cannot go into that experiment more deeply now because I have to conclude. I think the key insight that I take from the thinking about this question of interface is that the design should make constraints navigable rather than invisible. An interface that hides its epistemological assumptions is one that cannot be criticized, learned from, or improved. An interface that makes those assumptions visible, however incompletely, however approximately, is one that researchers can engage with critically, that can teach the practices of source criticism and epistemic humility, alongside the substantive historical contents it mediates, and that can be progressively improved as the theoretical and technical understanding of such problems develop. This is ultimately what it means to design for subjects rather than for users, to design for the researcher who is changed by the archive encounter as well as changing it, who brings critical reflexivity to the tools they use as well as to the sources they read, and who understands that the interface itself is a primary source, a designed object that encodes specific theories of knowledge, specific models of evidence, specific visions of what the past is, how it can be known, and whose experience contains or doesn't. So the archival multiverse is not a technical problem to be solved. It is a philosophical condition to be inhabited critically and productively with tools designed to make that habitation as honest, rigorous, and generous, and as open as the complexity of the historical record demands. Thank you very much.